The date is September 19th, 1944. The village of Reticourt-le-Petit, eastern France, Lorraine. Unterscharführer Klaus Bauer, a name reconstructed from unit rosters of the 111th Panzer Brigade. The records do not clearly attribute this specific account to one man, has been inside his Panther tank for 11 hours. The hull smells like diesel exhaust, gun propellant, and the particular kind of sweat that only comes from sustained fear. His mouth tastes like iron. The radio crackles. He ignores it. He is watching the tree lying through the gunner's sight, and what he sees there makes perfect sense to him. 3 M4 Shermans. American. Moving across open ground at roughly 12 miles per hour, left to right, crossing a shallow ridge. Exposed flanks, no infantry support visible. This is, by every calculation he has been trained to make, a gift. The Panther carries a 75mm Quack 42 gun, a weapon that, at this range, 800 meters, will punch through the Sherman's armor before the American crew hears the shot. The ballistics are not in question. The geometry is not in question. The Panther's crew drills this every week. Halt, acquire, fire, confirm, move. The 5 steps: clean, reliable, acquire, confirm, move. The 5 steps. The German army has won this exchange dozens of times in the past 3 months in Italy, in Normandy, in hedgerow country where the superior range of the Panther turned every engagement into a one-sided equation. Bauer calls out the command. His driver stops. The tank halts in the low ground at the edge of a wheat field, hull down, exposed only from the turret up. This is doctrine. This is correct. The gunner settles the reticle onto the lead Sherman. Range confirmed. Traversal speed, 0. Target not maneuvering. Trigger. The Panther fires. And the Sherman is not where it was. Not subtly not where it was. Not drifted 5 meters to the right. It has moved. Genuinely, meaningfully moved during the 2-second firing sequence, and the round passes behind its rear deck and detonates in the dirt 30 meters beyond. Before Bauer can process this, before his loader has rammed the second shell, and before his gunner has reacquired, the Sherman fires. It fires while still moving. The round impacts the Panther's forward glacis plate, fails to penetrate, but the concussion is violent enough to throw Bauer's head into the radio mount. He sees white. His ears ring in that high-pitched, absolute way that tells you the world has just changed its rules without warning you. The Shermans are gone, disappeared behind the ridge. And now there are 2 more, on a different axis, from a direction he did not expect, and they are also moving. Bauer cannot explain what just happened. The Panther's gun is superior. The range was ideal. His crew performed the sequence correctly. By every principle he has been taught that Sherman should have been burning 30 seconds ago. It is not burning. His crew is shaken. And the Americans are somewhere he cannot find them. He cannot explain it. Not yet. This is not the story you think it is. If you've read anything about the Sherman tank, you know the narrative. Undergunned, underarmored, and so prone to catching fire that Allied crews called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." The Germans had the Panther. They had the Tiger. On paper, they had a machine that should have owned every engagement at medium and long range. The technical specifications say the Americans were outmatched. The battlefield outcome says something different entirely. The real question is not why the Sherman lost individual tank duels. The question is why German tank commanders, again and again, reported engagements where everything went right and then, inexplicably, went wrong. Why prisoners taken in Lorraine and the Ardennes described American tanks that seemed to break the rules of armored combat as the Germans understood them. The answer is far more extraordinary than a better gun or thicker armor. When the Panther was got. To understand what Bauer experienced, you first have to understand why he had every reason to be confident. By the summer of 1944, the German Panzerwaffe had developed the most sophisticated tank gunnery doctrine in the world. It was built on a single foundational insight in an exchange between two tanks. The one that fires first, accurately, wins. Everything else is secondary. Speed of first-round effect, as German instructors called it, was the god of armored combat, and the system they built around that principle was extraordinary. German tanks were designed to halt before firing, not as a limitation, as a deliberate tactical choice. When a Panther stopped, its gun stabilized on all axes by virtue of the platform simply being still. The optics on German tanks, the lights or Carl Zeiss telescopic sights, were genuinely superior to anything the Allies fielded in 1944. The magnification was higher, the reticle graduation more precise, the field of view more carefully calibrated for long-range shooting. At ranges beyond 800 meters, a trained German gunner in a halted Panther could place his first round on a stationary target, with a probability that Western Allied tank commanders found alarming when they captured the after-action reports, and the gun itself. The Quack 42 L-70 on the Panther, the long-barreled 75mm, fired a round at 935 meters per second. For comparison, the standard Sherman 75mm Emphibos Ken fired at 619 meters per second. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between a weapon that can kill a Panther from the front at 800 meters and a weapon that hands of a Sherman crew targeting a Panther at the same range is essentially throwing rocks at a castle wall. The Sherman 76mm upgrade, rushed into production after Normandy, improved this significantly. But even then, penetrating Panther front armor from range required nearly perfect shot placement. Put yourself inside the mind of a German battalion commander in France in 1944. You have a company of Panthers. You have terrain you can use, ridge lines, farm structures, tree lines. You position your tanks hull down, meaning the hull is hidden below the crest of the terrain feature and only the turret is exposed. You wait. The Americans come forward as they must, because they are the ones advancing. They cross open ground. You fire first. Your rounds arrive before the sound does. And you do this at ranges that the American 75mm simply cannot reciprocate effectively. This is not arrogance. This is physics. This is what the numbers actually said. This is what the numbers actually said. From June to August 1944, in the grinding nightmare of the Normandy bocage, German armored units defending against Operation Cobra reported kill ratios that, in specific engagements, reached 5 or 6 American vehicles for every Panther lost. At Villers-Bocage on June 13th, a single Tiger company under Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann destroyed somewhere between 14 and 25 Allied armored vehicles in roughly 15 minutes. The precise number remains disputed by historians, but not the catastrophic asymmetry of the result. The American and British armor in Normandy was advancing into a doctrine that was eating it alive. German commanders were rationally proud of this system. It was elegant. It was lethal. It assumed that the defining moment of a tank battle was the first accurate shot, and it had been designed, from optics to training to tactical positioning, to make that first shot belong to Germany. The Americans needed to change the geometry, and what they built to change it did not begin where you expect. The answer to the Panther was not a new gun. It was not a new tank. It was not even a new tactic exactly. It was a small spinning device that had been bolted to American tanks since 1942 and, for most of those 2 years, sat largely idle. Because nobody had built the doctrine to use it. The M4 Sherman was equipped from early production with a gyroscopic gun stabilizer. The system was called the Westinghouse gun stabilizer, and its function was elegantly simple. It used a gyroscope spinning at high speed to detect the pitch of the tank's hull as it moved over uneven terrain, and it automatically adjusted the gun's elevation to compensate, keeping the barrel pointed at the same spot in space, regardless of what the tank was doing beneath it. In theory. And this is the part that changes everything. A Sherman gunner could lay his reticle on a target while the tank was moving at road speed, and the gun would hold that elevation through bumps and dips and the constant kinetic chaos of cross-country movement. This is not the story of a secret weapon. The stabilizer was not secret. The Germans knew about it. Captured Shermans were examined thoroughly by German ordnance teams as early as Tunisia. What the Germans concluded, and what many American tank commanders also concluded for the first 2 years of the war, was that it didn't work. Not reliably. Not at the ranges where tank duels were decided. They were right. And they were catastrophically wrong. The stabilizer, as designed, could not guarantee a first-round kill on a moving tank at 600 meters. That was true. But that was the wrong question. The right question. The question that a relatively small number of American tankers, most of them in the 4th Armored Division under General John Wood, began asking in the late summer of 1944 was not, can we guarantee a kill on the move? The question was, what does moving do to the enemy's ability to kill us? The insight that emerged from the open terrain of Lorraine was not handed down from Army Doctrine Headquarters. It came from junior officers and sergeants who had survived enough engagements to notice a pattern. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Faypool, a real man, a gunner and tank commander from Texas, who would become the highest-scoring American tank ace of the war, had been developing his own understanding of armored engagements since North Africa. Poole and men like him noticed something the Germans had not accounted for in their fire discipline equations. A moving target is exponentially harder to hit than a stationary one, even if the moving target is firing a less accurate shot. The German halt and fire doctrine assumed that the act of stopping was neutral, a brief pause that cost nothing. It was not neutral. When a Panther halted to fire, it told the world exactly where it was. It became a stationary target. And a stationary target, even at 800 meters, even with inferior optics, was something an American gunner with a gyro-stabilized gun could begin to work with. Nobody had fully exploited this before because doing it required a shift in how tankers thought about their job. The American tanker had to accept that his first shot, fired on the move, might miss. He had to be willing to suppress the enemy, to force the German crew to button up their hatches and lose visibility, to interrupt their firing sequence, to make them uncertain, while the Sherman repositioned to a better angle or closed the distance where the M4's gun became more effective. It was fire and movement, applied not to infantry squads, but to 30-ton steel machines, and it required the kind of tactical aggression that did not come naturally to men who had been told their tanks were outgunned. What no one had accounted for, not the German planners, not the American doctrine writers in Washington, was what would happen when entire American tank platoons and companies executed this principle simultaneously, in coordination, across multiple axes. The mechanical advantage of the gyrostabilizer was already significant. What was coming next was what made it lethal. What the stopwatch actually proved here is the arithmetic that the German Panzerwaffe never fully calculated, and it is worth reading slowly. A Panther, in optimal conditions with a trained crew, could complete the halt-acquire fire-assess-move sequence in approximately 12 to 15 seconds. This was the time from when the driver received the stop command to when the tank was moving again. 12 seconds was the benchmark that German armored schools used. In actual field conditions, accounting for terrain, stress, and communication lag inside the crew, historians and post-war analysts have placed the realistic average closer to 15 to 18 seconds. During those 15 seconds, the Panther was stationary. A stationary object at 800 meters subtends approximately the same angular width in a telescopic sight, regardless of whose side you are on. The Americans could see it. Now consider the Sherman's firing cycle on the move. The gyrostabilizer held elevation. The gunner still had to traverse manually to track a target, and lateral stabilization on early Shermans was not automatic. That came later. By the combination of the stabilizer maintaining elevation, the M4's faster turret traverse motor compared to the Panther's manual traverse, and the training to fire during a brief moment of terrain-induced stability, what crews called firing in the dip. when the tank settled into a hollow, produced something remarkable. A Sherman crew that had trained for shoot and move could get around downrange toward a specific point every 8 to 10 seconds while still moving. Read that last sentence carefully. While still moving. The Panthers' first shot advantage, the core assumption of German tank doctrine, was built on the premise that its target would be stationary or predictably moving at the moment of fire, and that after the Panther fired and moved, the counterfire would need to reacquire. Against a stationary Sherman or an M4 crew that had been trained in traditional doctrine and would stop to return fire, this worked. Against a company of Shermans that did not stop, that kept moving and firing, the calculation collapsed. The famous case study that illustrates what should have happened, what the German specs guaranteed, is the Battle of Proschnau's Panther Company at Dompierre on September 13, 1944. A company of Panthers from the 112th Panzer Brigade encountered French Shermans of the 2nd French Armored Division in conditions the Germans considered favorable. The Panthers opened at range in conditions the Germans considered favorable. The Panthers opened rain. They should have dominated. They did not. The French, trained by American advisors in mobility-focused doctrine, kept their tanks moving, forced the Panthers to continuously reacquire, and called artillery on the halted German positions. By the end of the engagement, the German company had lost most of its vehicles. The French lost a fraction. This was 6 days before Bauer's engagement at Ricquecourt. The archival record contains a remarkable document from this period. General Major Hasso von Manteuffel, one of the most capable German armored commanders of the war, wrote in an October 1944 assessment, preserved in German Federal Military Archives records, a passage that translates approximately as, "The American tanks have learned to move in a manner that denies our crews the calculation time our gunnery depends upon. They do not fight us with better weapons. They fight us with worse weapons that they refuse to stand still with." That is a German general explaining, in writing, that American tactical mobility had negated German technical superiority. He did not say it with contempt for the Americans. He said it with the cold acknowledgement of a man watching his doctrine fail in real time and trying to understand why. Colonel, later Brigadier General, Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, a real figure, later to become Army Chief of Staff, described his approach in a post-action report from September 1944. His tanks were instructed to never present a stationary profile to a known enemy position for more than 5 seconds. Not a doctrine from headquarters. A rule his crews had worked out from surviving German fire. 5 seconds. That was the window German crews needed to complete an accurate firing solution on a stationary target. Deny them 5 consecutive seconds of a stationary target, and their accuracy dropped sharply. The numbers from 4th Armored's engagements in the rain bore this out. German company commanders began reporting in their logs, something they struggled to describe technically but recognized tactically. American tanks were firing on the move and not missing as often as the physics suggested they should. One regimental log entry from the 111th Panzer Brigade, dated late September 1944, notes, the exact translation varies by source, that American units appeared to have solved the problem of movement and fire in a way we have not. They had. And the week that would prove it beyond any doubt was about to begin. This video gives you the story, but the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten heroes. Free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. Now back in the video. The Battle of Ricquecourt. The operation did not have a dramatic codename. It happened in the rolling farmland of the Moselle Plateau, a landscape of chalk roads and shallow ridges between the villages of Ricquecourt, Lizay, and Ricquecourt-La Petite. American fuel shortages had slowed Patton's Third Army to a crawl. The 4th Armored Division, which had been one of the war's most aggressive armored units since its breakout from Avranches in late July, was now holding an exposed salient with insufficient infantry support, minimal air cover because of persistent autumn fog, and lines of supply stretched to the absolute limit. German planners saw an opportunity. The 5th Panzer Army, reconstituted after the catastrophic losses of the Falaise Pocket, had been reinforced with 3 panzer brigades, the 111th, 112th, and 113th, equipped with brand-new Panthers and trained crews. The mission was clear: drive into the 4th Armored's flank, cut the American salient, and demonstrate that the September reverses in Lorraine had been aberrations, not trends. On paper, the Germans had the advantage in nearly every category. The Panzer Brigades together fielded approximately 300 armored vehicles, including Panthers and Panzer IVs. The 4th Armored, thinned and supply-starved, could field fewer than 200 operational tanks, predominantly Shermans with the upgraded 76mm gun, but a substantial number still carrying the older 75mm. German commanders calculated that American air power, which had been decisive throughout the summer, was neutralized by the fog. German armor, they reasoned, would fight this battle on its own terms, at the ranges and under the conditions where the Panther was designed to dominate. The engagement began on September 18th, when elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade struck toward Araucourt from the northeast. They came in the early morning using the same fog that was grounding American aircraft. The Panther companies advanced in the way their doctrine prescribed, using terrain features, hull down when possible, engaging at range. What they encountered was Colonel Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion in motion. The 37th did not form a defensive line. Abrams's commanders pushed their tanks off the roads and onto the cross-country terrain, splitting into platoons and sections, advancing on multiple axes simultaneously, denying the German commanders the kind of clean bilateral engagement that their gunnery training assumed. Individual Sherman platoon leaders, men whose names appear in company after action reports filed at the National Archives, names like Lieutenant James Leach and Sergeant Hulon Whittington, the latter real Medal of Honor recipient from a related engagement, were executing the shoot-and-move principle not as a tactic but as a reflex. Fire. Move. Fire from the new position. Never let the gun go quiet. Never let the hull go still. The fog, which the Germans had counted on as a shield, became a liability. Had the ranges where September fog in Lorraine reduced visibility, frequently below 400 meters, the Sherman 76mm gun could kill a Panther through its front armor with regularity. The extended range at which the Panther's superior ballistics would have mattered was invisible. The Germans were fighting inside the American killing envelope without knowing it. By midday on September 18th, the 111th Panzer Brigade had lost 31 tanks. The 37th Tank Battalion had lost 3. The Germans regrouped and tried again on September 19th. The records show different unit dispositions, a different approach axis, an attempt to use the night and the continued fog to reset the conditions. The 4th Armored's Combat Command A, under Brigadier General Herbert Ernest, responded with the same principle at scale: dispersion, movement, and the suppression doctrine that denied German crews the 5 consecutive seconds they needed to guarantee a kill. A German prisoner captured on September 20th, his account recorded in the 4th Armored Division's G2 intelligence log, a document housed in the Patton Museum collection, told his American interrogators something that directly mirrors the experience of the man we opened this story with. The prisoner, a Panther gunner from the 111th Brigade, described firing on American tanks that he was certain his shot had hit. When the smoke cleared, the Americans were in different positions. He could not account for how they had moved so quickly. He said, and this is quoted in translation from the original intelligence log, that the American tanks did not behave like tanks. He meant it as a complaint. It was actually an obituary for a doctrine. By September 30th, when the Battle of Araucourt effectively concluded with the German Panzer Brigades withdrawing to reorganize, the accounting was stark. The 3 German Panzer Brigades had lost an estimated 86 tanks destroyed and many more damaged or mechanically abandoned. The 4th Armored Division, across all its elements engaged in the Lorraine fighting, had lost fewer than 30 vehicles to enemy fire during the same period, though the numbers in some secondary sources run slightly higher depending on how vehicle losses are categorized. Even at the upper range of American losses, the ratio was not what German doctrine had predicted. It was the inverse of V's bocage. It was the inverse of everything the Panther's specification sheet said should happen. General Patton, in his diary for October 1944, noted with characteristic plainness that the 4th Armored had proven the method. He did not elaborate at length. Patton rarely needed to. The numbers spoke in a language that required no translation. The real final test was still coming, in December, in the snow. The Ardennes, the place where the Germans would try one last time to reset the geometry, and the 4th Armored would drive through that frozen nightmare toward Bastogne in the kind of conditions, ice, darkness, congested roads, no air support, that should have negated every advantage they had built. It didn't. But that is another film. Back to the wheat field, Klaus Bauer. Our reconstructed German gunner, halted on the edge of that September wheat field, experienced something specific. We can now name every part of it. His Panther stopped to fire. In those 15 seconds of stillness, the gyrostabilizer on the lead Sherman allowed its gunner to maintain a rough firing solution on the Panther's position without stopping the vehicle. The Sherman fired on the move. It missed, but it didn't need to hit. It needed to move. By the time the Panther's second round was ready, the gyrostabilizer had allowed the Sherman to relocate to a position that was not where the German gunner's muscle memory told him it would be. And the second and third Shermans, coordinating on radio nets that the German crews on their older communication systems struggled to match in volume and speed, were already on different axes. What Bauer experienced was not a malfunction. It was not luck. It was a system executing at scale that had been built from the ground up to break the equation his entire training assumed was unbreakable. The 4 gaps that closed on him that morning were these. The gap between a superior gun and a useful gun, closed by mobility. The Panther's Quay 42 was lethal at range. Required a stationary target. Deny the stationary target, and the superior gun becomes merely a very expensive tool that cannot find its work. The gap between firing while moving and firing accurately while moving. Closed by the Westinghouse gyrostabilizer. Not a perfect solution. Experienced Sherman crews openly described the stabilizer as a suppression and positioning tool, not a precision instrument, but precise enough to force German crews to respond, to button up, to break their own firing rhythm. The gap between individual tank action and coordinated unit action. Closed by the SCR 508 radio system, fitted to every American tank from early production, allowing platoon leaders to adjust fires and reposition vehicles in real time. German radio discipline was good, but German tactical communication was designed for a halt and control style of command. The American system allowed for the kind of fluid, constant radio chatter that move and fire doctrine required. The gap between doctrine and practice, closed by men. By Lafayette Poole and his crew accumulating dozens of kills through stubborn experimentation. By Creighton Abrams making the 5-second rule a standard that his entire battalion internalized. By unnamed platoon sergeants in Lorraine who watched enough Germans die trying to reacquire moving targets that they stopped asking for permission to stop. This system was not perfect. Men died inside Shermans. The tank did catch fire more readily than it should. A Tiger or Panther that got a clean shot at close range on a stationary Sherman did exactly what it was designed to do. The system never made the Sherman invincible. It made the engagement conditions that would make the Sherman vulnerable persistently, deliberately, systematically harder to achieve. The men who built this system have names, most of them, in the records. Colonel Creighton Abrams, General John Tiger Jack Wood, Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, who was wounded at Stoumont, Belgium in September 1944 after destroying 258 enemy vehicles, a number documented in Army records that sounds impossible until you see the operational tempo of the 4th Armored Division across 3 months of warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Cohen, commanding the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, who understood that tankers and infantry had to train the doctrine together, or neither made it work. And the anonymous German gunner, Aubauer, who sat in the wreckage of a halted Panther on a September morning in Lorraine and tried to understand why correct technique had produced the wrong result. He was asking the wrong question. He was looking for a mistake in his execution, when the mistake was in his assumptions. The Americans had not built a better tank. They had simply refused to sit still in the one they had. If your grandfather or great-grandfather served in American armored units in the European theater, the 4th Armed, the 2nd, the 3rd, any of them, I'd genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. What did he say about the Shermans? What did he say about the Shermans? What did he say about moving? History that makes you comfortable is usually history that's been simplified. The truth about American armor in World War II is harder and more remarkable than either the apologist or the critic admits. These men were not given the best machines. They built the best system. There is a difference, and it matters. Subscribe if you want more history told, the way it actually happened, with the numbers, the names, the friction, and the full credit that every soldier on every side deserves.